This workshop is about seeing the forest and trees, and I've just said it. You didn't give me an answer. Did you have that saying in English? Does that exist?
Seeing the forest and trees? I think so. I think I've heard it before.
Ah, okay. I don't know if it exists in your individual languages. We have it in German. It basically means that, or what I want to talk about is that what I see very often is that people get so involved with individual arguments and with the debate at hand that they fail to step back and try to get a look at the broader picture and what actually is going on and what are the important fundamental clashes going on in the debate, because they are trying to rebut every single argument. And I think, firstly, if you're able to step back a little bit and look at it from a broader perspective, it saves you a lot of work, or it can save you a lot of work. It doesn't take away the task from you to analyze the specific debate at hand, whatever the topic is. But on the other hand, it helps you to understand how debates function together, how you can use arguments in different debates, and they are always structurally a very equal, a very similar argument. And that helps you to understand better what's going on and consequently to explain to a judge better what you've seen and thus win the debate. Okay? So basically this is about analysis, basically this is about fundamental ideas of debates, about philosophic principles that we use and that we employ in debates. And before all you guys came in, I wanted to say that firstly I want to talk about clashes, because I think it's a word that everybody knows, everybody uses now and then. I'm not sure if everybody understands what it is. And then secondly, to have a look at a few clashes, and what I would say is that we just take a few motions that I have on my paper and then analyze them and see if we can find out what clashes are in that one and what would be a cool way of analyzing it. So to broaden your view and to make things interesting. Now firstly, what is a clash? Everybody says it, okay? In debates you have to clash. What does that mean? What is the definition of a clash? Suggestions? Confrontation of what?
Competing arguments.
Competing arguments?
Or
How?
two sides of one issue actually conflict.
Two sides of an issue?
Yeah.
An issue could have more than two sides.
Okay.
At least.
Is it more of a counter-argument when you directly engage with an argument by providing a counter-argument?
What is a counter-argument? I would say, firstly, you're right. Okay, it's two different, a clash always consists of two different ideas, or more, but I think in general it's two. That's a good clash, because it's made very easy then to say, I think the one is right or the other one's right. I don't think it's the flipping of a coin. I don't think a clash is not a yes or no question. That is how you can frame a clash, but a clash is ultimately something else. Okay, but what are those argument and counter-argument? What do you use as arguments or counter-arguments?
You can't apply both things. It's one or the other.
What do you mean? Any examples? Anything maybe that makes it easier? What is a typical clash that everybody knows?
It's a decision somehow, isn't it? Between the, for example, what we have now, between the freedom of speech and between the danger of the denial. That basically, what is more important? It's like the key battleground, which you say is winning because of you value a certain thing more than another one.
I think it's like two different perspectives looking at the same thing, the same issue.
Yes, you're trying, I know, I agree, you're trying to resolve an issue. This freedom of speech thing, you just said values, so I think that's a very important thing. In a clash, I would argue, on each side of the clash stands a fundamental value. Stands something that we think is important. Okay? Which means both sides of the clash have something to them, which is why we have a debate in the first place. If there was only one side that had all the good stuff and one side that had only negative consequences, it's very unlikely we would debate it. Okay? So first is, we have competing values on both sides. That's the first thing. What about those values? What is the nature of these values? How do they differ? What's the relationship between the two?
I think it's that in this particular proposal, you have to pick one because they're conflicting with each other, and then the clash comes when you try to put a hierarchy between the values and try to decide which would be more important.
Exactly. I think. Sorry.
No, I'd say that they had to have some type of common ground, and then some type of difference.
What do you mean with common ground?
Okay, because for example, if it's the only way how you could relate and make the clash. If there's no common ground, there'd be just two separate arguments. There's no clash.
True. I think the common ground is the issue you're debating about, right? Like he said. You have an issue and you're trying to find out what are the values that are important in this particular issue.
No, I'd say that I might not be correct.
Oh, never mind.
Okay, but I'd say that you can have an issue and you can have two arguments that dispute that issue on the counterparts, but still they don't clash because they have no common ground. I mean, you can't refute one with the other. There's just two separate different arguments.
True.
There's no clash there.
Okay. My approach is I'm not exactly sure what you want to say, but maybe we can reconcile this somehow. I think one of the things in the clash is that it's not that these values are distinctly different. It's not possible to collapse one value on the other and completely subsume it. Okay? Each of them has sort of its own substance, if you like, and you would have to establish in the debate what that substance specifically is. What does that mean, first of all? You need to define it, you need to show why it's relevant, and then you need to show, and I think you were actually very accurate on that one, how the value you are fighting for outweighs the other one in a specific debate. The great thing about clashes is that they can never be resolved. There's no definite answer. There's nothing that you can use as sort of the standard approach to it, but at every debate it's always about how do we weigh in the clash that we have into this specific debate.
Like, so when you try to put up this hierarchy in the values and outweigh one with the other, do you think you have to do it as this value definitely always outweighs the other one, or in this issue
In this
value?
issue.
Okay.
In this issue. Whatever, well, you deal with the proposal of the proposition, and whatever they've said, then you apply your values to. Or if you're the proposition, you need to show why a certain value needs to be pushed further than it has been so far, which is then altering the status quo, logically. Okay? And the interesting thing is, I think there is only a limited number of clashes. Okay? I'm just going to give you, I have 4 on my paper right now. There's a 5th, which I forgot. Maybe we're going to find a few more, but there's only a limited number. I think the first one that everybody knows and everybody always talks about is this idea of individual liberty versus security. Okay, that's one of those very fundamental clashes that we always have. We're going to talk about those in a second. Secondly, there is the question of the individual versus the common good, or benefit, whichever you want to say. Then there is, I found the 5th one. There is means and ends. So you want to achieve something, and what kind of means are you going to employ to reach your end? Then there is the wonderful clash of short versus long term. And one which is surprisingly important is integration versus isolation. It's also one that ever again comes up.
Could you give an example of the means versus ends clash?
Yes. That this is a bit difficult, but I think it's a very typical strategy to say, if you want to achieve an aim, what kind of means can you employ? Okay, and the one side would say, whatever means we use, we have to use a different approach. And the other side would say it's justified to employ a certain kind of means, because it's very important and essential to reach the end.
Like parents and kids, if you take away from the drunk or abusive parents their kids, does it justify the kids, or he's got to be then brought up in a foster house?
Yeah, does that justify, does the end of saving the children from their bad parents justify the means that you employ, as in taking away the kids, or is that actually a very bad idea for the kids? I think that's the way.
So procedural versus substantive.
Sorry?
Procedural versus some
Yeah.
substance.
Means and ends, I think that's, yeah.
So this morning would have been a means versus ends debate that we say, in order to achieve the end of not having the danger of what could happen if we allow people to say the Holocaust has happened, the mean of limitation of freedom of speech is justified.
It's your task to argue, so do it.
So the clash is not always obvious.
No, this is the thing. This is why it's analysis. This is why this sounds very easy now to say, okay, there's basic clashes, and there might be a few more. And I think you're all intelligent enough to look into debates and try to find out what's going on. But this is what distinguishes good speakers from not so good speakers, that they are able to look at the broader picture and to say, this is an age-old fight. It's a very old question, and we are going to show you how this one pans out in this concrete debate. Now, when I say, and I think this is about the common ground, okay? This idea of competing values. Let's look at the first one for a minute. The idea of liberty and security. What will definitely one in a liberty and security debate about, I don't know, let's say public video cameras or any other of those, what will definitely one of the speakers come up with?
Public video cameras. They're the one that.
Trying to be very clever.
Privacy.
Privacy, yes, they will say privacy is important, but what is definitely one wise guy going to say?
Which side?
Sorry?
On which side?
Doesn't matter. What are they going to try to do?
Offer state intervention into the private life, second
Well,
efficiency. Do the cameras actually justify
yes.
security?
Wait, what's the topic exactly?
Public video cameras. Public spaces should be monitored with video cameras or should not be monitored. Okay? It doesn't matter on which side you are. What is the liberty guy going to try and what's the security guy going to try?
Security guy might say if you don't have to hide anything, then you don't have to be worried. So
Yes, but in terms of this clash, are they going to say liberty is not important at all and we should only go for security?
Justify it.
No, liberty is either more important than security or essential for security.
Well, what you will always see in these debates is that they will try to steal the other value as well. Okay, and it's important that you stand your ground, that you defend your ground, and you defend your value against the other one. Okay, they are not, in saying that they are essentially different does not mean that they are mutually exclusive. Okay, it's very obvious that in order to be free, you need a certain amount of security, and well, maybe the other way around not. In order to be secure, you maybe need a certain amount of liberty, whatever you frame security as. Okay, but this is the interesting thing. There is a common ground. Of course, they can exist simultaneously. There is a certain balance between the two. And the idea of the debate is not to say that they are mutually exclusive, but the question is where to strike the balance. Where do we draw the line? Especially in this debate, what is always the framework of debates? What is the model that hardly anyone ever talks about but that you always use in your debates?
You first rebuttal and then you have argument?
Well, it's a parliamentary debate, okay? So what is the foundation of having a parliamentary debate?
Policy?
It's to have a parliament. It's a bit silly, okay? But the standard model of debate is always Western liberal democracy. So there's a few things that you will have to bring up in your speeches, as in liberty is important, it's an important value, we need to defend it, okay? But I think the unsaid anti of a debate, something that always is part of the debate, is that we accept that human rights exist and that we should defend them, for instance, okay? And that if somebody then wants to take security measures, then he would have to go against liberalism and show why we should interfere with those basic rights of the people and why there's good reasons of putting up some security measures. All I'm saying is you shouldn't fall into the trap of trying to steal too much of the other side's value. It's good to say it, it's good to remark that they are not mutually exclusive, okay? But this idea of we can only be free if we are secure, I said this yesterday in my refutation workshop. What is the logical endpoint of that?
There will all be free in our prisons or in our cages.
Well, you could say you could lock up everyone, everybody's perfectly secure, and you're entirely free in your prison cell. Okay, you are effectively then corrupting the idea of freedom, which is non-intervention, by saying a little intervention doesn't hurt, you're still free. Okay, and then you're on a slippery slope to somewhere. This is an obviously ridiculous example, but this is something that happens when you try to steal the other side, because then these systems interfere. And this is what I mean. You cannot collapse one value on the other. You cannot say ultimately freedom equals security. It doesn't work. It's both important things, but they are distinctly different, and they should stay like that, because otherwise debates get very boring.
You mentioned the implicit reason that it's a Western liberal democracy is at the base of debate. Is it like, can you ever make that explicit? Like, can you ever defend yourself on that ground that in this format we are debating Western liberal democracy, so we have to value this kind of?
Well, what do the others say? I think it's something that it's worth thinking about for a second.
Because like I've had that done. Like I didn't know that the Western liberal democracies was the model we agreed to in parliamentary till in one debate about I forget what the debate was about, but there was an issue of democracy, right? I was taking an anti-democracy stand, and the other team's rebuttal to my argument wasn't why democracy is good, but just in the fact that we're debating parliamentary debate. It's a Western liberal democracy, so that argument is just not valid in this form.
Why should it not be valid?
Yeah.
I think there's a difference between a framework and, if you like, sort of an eternal truth in debate. Democracy could abolish itself. The Germans have managed to do that very efficiently. Okay, so democracy could decide that democracy is nonsense and get on with our lives and have a proper dictatorship. So, if you're able to make a convincing argument and to say this whole liberalism is very bad, and in fact we need socialism and we need communal ideas again, why not? If you can defend them, then it's not. Hang on, just a second. It's not enough then from the other side to say this doesn't work because our model is a liberal democracy. Then they would have to defend why liberal democracy or why their model of their approach is better than whatever you were saying. That, at least that's my view.
But what about then the German constitution, which would not allow the party whose political agenda is officially cancelling democracy and putting an end to democracy of not being allowed to join the parliament? Because then you can't de facto put an end to democracy because you won't allow any party which will put this on political agenda to join the parliament to push it through.
So, what's the conclusion? Sorry.
I mean, it's a bit tautological of the question if there is really no end to democracy, because we say that democracy is German example.
Modern German democracy cannot abolish itself because the constitution prohibits that.
Well, as long as you have the constitution says you cannot abolish it. If you have a revolution, decide to get rid of the constitution, that's it for democity.
Or you can change the constitution and then abolish it.
Actually, you can't. You can't change the German constitution. This is something that you might come across when you're debating Germans, because they are always so proud of their constitution.
You can change Venezuelan constitution.
Which is not even a constitution.
And Germans, many German debaters, especially when they start off, okay, we are very proud of our constitution. We think it's a very good one and it's a very liberal one and everything. Okay, but the problem is that these people don't see that even in that constitution, a certain status quo is enshrined, and you could potentially change it. Okay, legally that would be a very hard thing to do, but you can still contest the ideas that are expressed in the constitution, and you need to move beyond that. Okay, of course you could change everything, even though the constitution prohibits to change certain fundamental values. It is the so-called eternity clause. Okay, it states that this will stay like that for all eternity, which of course doesn't mean that this piece of paper will exist for all eternity. It would be good if it did, but okay, for the moment we have nothing better. But still, even constitutions can be abolished if you agree that this constitution is ultimately a bad idea. The reason why it usually doesn't come up, and why usually you don't debate about the fundamental principles of the debate itself, is because that would be a little bit overreaching, and most issues can be solved within democracy, and most issues can be dealt with within democracy. But I think about it for a second. You can easily have a debate about the idea that debating is nonsense. Okay? It's an interesting mind game. If you should try it at home, okay, and then have a debate about whether debating makes sense or not. So attack the fundamental value of the idea of the debate itself. That's going to work. But back to our idea of the clashes. Okay, what I mean is especially as a second team, it's always good to lean back a little and see what has been going on and put things in a new context. And if you're able to find one of those fundamental clashes and show what are the values at stake and how do I defend the side that I'm on, then usually you have a very decent chance of winning the debate. What is extremely important, I think, is, and I've stated this over and over again during this academy already, that you look behind what those words mean. Okay? A lot of people just say, liberty is an important value, it's more important than security in this context, and here's why. Let me give you a few reasons. The problem is that they never properly define liberty, or security for that matter. What do you mean by that? What is that supposed to mean? And then it's very easy to fall into this trap that I mentioned earlier of collapsing the values and putting them on each other or trying to reconcile one with the other in a weird way if you're not precise on definitions. If you don't show what is the specific nature of any of those values that you're talking about. So for instance, let's try it. What is liberty? What is a proper definition of liberty and freedom? A working one. It's not that easy, is it?
But when we define debate, we can, for example, pick up freedom of speech and then put it in the context like that everyone has the right to write something somewhere and publish it. I don't know, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Try it, but try a definition of freedom. Freedom is.
Freedom is the principle that everyone in society should be able and be allowed to do whatever he or she wants to a certain extent.
But for freedom, it's very important that our freedom ends with someone else's freedom.
Where
you know
other
what I
person
mean?
freedom starts.
Yes.
Is that necessarily true? For the
Yes.
principle of freedom?
If I can do whatever I want, if I jeopardize him, that's not okay. That's not his freedom. There are some boundaries.
But you're still
That's the-
acting out freedom. So
But
you
this
just
is
judge it, but it's still your freedom.
This
I
is
I
the
mean, as
collective
a
definition
concept
of
of
it.
freedom,
Then.
yeah.
I think this is very interesting because these are two different definitions. The one that we heard here is that you're able to do whatever you want without anybody else interfering, okay, which is a radical definition of liberty. And I think a proper one, and you are already putting it in the collective. You're already saying, my freedom ends somewhere. There is no such thing as absolute freedom to do whatever I want, and I need to be restricted at some point. Okay. I think defending that, yours is probably the more sensible one. Okay. But if you are defending freedom and already saying that your freedom ends somewhere and that there is a ground for intervention, that's exactly when you're interfering with somebody else, you're opening the doors for the other side to go into that and say, okay, now let's talk about the limits. Okay, let's not talk about the principle of freedom anymore, but let's see how we can limit it and how we can boil it down and how we can take some of that away because, I don't know, of terrorism threats or such, any blank random argument you could put candidate. But that's interesting, okay? Two different definitions. It's very important you're clear on what you're talking about. Whether you agree that freedom is limited in itself, as you said, okay, the principle of freedom is inherently limited, or whether you say, no, I'm defending freedom as a radical principle, and then I might have other values like security in society or like other people not getting harmed that get in the way of freedom, and then it rebalances the clash. It is a different clash, okay? What is security then? Essentially.
Protects them.
A system under which every individual's life and personal belongings are guaranteed.
Sorry, second.
A system under which every individual's life and personal belongings are guaranteed to not be interfered with.
Okay, yeah, guarantee, I would say, is a legal concept. Is safety and security, is that a legal thing?
It's a mental concept, or it's like
What is?
I would define security more in terms of a state in which you have a psychological peace, and like you have this assurance that you can function without being under threat or having your belongings under threat.
Okay, so you're saying it's more a mental state than a factual state.
That no one can interfere into your, I don't know, life, privacy,
Mhm.
properties, and series of other.
I think it's partly what she already brought in, that security could be defined as a state in which one is not harmfully influenced by external factors, whether that may be other individuals, the group, this environment, or whatever.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good one to say. Security means being safe from harm. Okay? Which basically means no one interfering with your personal sphere. And you could, of course, go on to define then what is the personal sphere, how far does it extend, where does it go? What is the foundation of that in political theory, and what does that usually justify? Just to have the random, because I think all of you know it, just to make it clear.
Sovereignty.
Sorry?
Sovereignty.
Sovereignty, yeah, in an extent.
Restriction of liberty.
Yes, in what way?
Well, and that restriction of liberty guarantees, brings people a state of harmlessness or safeness of harm. Who brought in the relevant theory that I'm talking about? And what is it, that theory? Don't look at me that puzzle. Hobbes.
Oh.
Thomas Hobbes. Okay? What did he say?
About contract that.
About contract that, yes. About security.
You have to give up
And
your rights.
The
liberty.
people, they transfer their rights to the state, and the state is due to protect them. And if they
They collapse the government.
yes, they will be in the same state that they were at the beginning, so they won't do that.
Uh-huh. Okay, interesting.
He has a natural state, and in this natural state everyone attacks himself, and you only fight for your own aims, and at some point everyone will accept that to achieve your own aims, which is existence, you must cooperate and therefore create this state, Leviathan, and give your power to that state, because you realize that your liberty, or you do what you want, is only achieved through the means of giving this power away.
So here we have the two definitions again, okay? That's the original definition here. The original idea of freedom is everybody is born absolutely free and everybody defends themselves and they can also attack others, okay? And then, of course, Hobbes was heavily influenced by the Civil War in England. And he'd seen how people had been killing each other for no reason. And he said, because one person is to the other one like a wolf, okay, and like a wild animal, we need to agree that we give away certain rights. We give up a certain portion of our freedom, build a new institution, which is the state, and then through that the state will be able to protect our freedom. Okay, but that of course means, note well, that people are not absolutely free anymore.
That's what I told it.
Okay. And exactly, and this is so entrenched in our thinking now that I think we don't think about what is freedom as such anymore, but always have that ante of the state needs to interfere in for certain reasons, which I don't think is a given necessarily. I'm not very convinced by social contract theory. I never signed the contract.
Yes.
Okay, I'm part of this society, I was born into it, I accept certain values of it, but I never signed a contract, definitely. And I don't think I accept that the state exists, that's okay with me, but I never consciously agreed to any of that. And the state was there before me. So all of that is just a construction. It's just a way of thinking about it, and it works rather well, okay? But it's not a proper theory as such. Okay? It doesn't really explain things because it just presupposes a few things. But this is taking away us from the issue. Let's look at a few motions and try to find out what are the important clashes in that one. First one, criminalize the Holocaust. You've all seen the debate now. So what do you think were important fundamental beliefs?
Freedom of speech on the one side.
Okay.
The side of opposition.
Freedom of thought.
Hang on. Freedom of speech versus? And now say not freedom of speech. No, don't say not freedom of speech. Give me a value that is important. What is on the other side of that clash?
I would say security.
Sorry?
I would say security.
Security? Would you agree? What do you mean by security?
I would say like individual liberty on the one hand, and the freedom of speech, and security on the other hand in terms of, again, going back to my little psychological understanding of that, security, knowing that nobody else is encroaching on your psychological well-being by kind of like ridiculing you or kind of insulting you or belittling you.
Okay, so saving people from harm, whatever that harm may be. Who are those people that need to be saved?
Descendants or survivors of the Holocaust.
Israelis.
So victims and people from Israel, maybe there's a few groups that you could mention.
From your list, it's more like individual versus common good, because is it your liberty of speech, like your individual right to speak, more important than some kind of benefits that it will give to the community if we forbid that speech?
If you phrase that in economic terms, how can you put that? If what the individual does has harmful effects to the whole,
Also externalities.
External effects. Okay, to say the externalities of whatever you're doing are so big that they influence the rest of society, therefore there's a problem. I think you could frame it in that. Okay, this is not an eternal list of clashes that I've given you. It's just a way of thinking about things and having different ideas. And you would still, I mean, this is your task, obviously, in further debates as well. Try to pick the essential clash. Try to pick the essential point of going about it. Okay. Any other ideas on criminalizing the Holocaust? Just one essential clash, or were there maybe several ones?
I also thought about individual liberty versus security.
I think that's the one we mentioned earlier, to say freedom of speech is on that liberty side. Everybody can do whatever they want, and also this whole idea of marketplace of ideas and exchange, there's a lot more to be said about it, okay? But I think you've all seen the debate.
Also integration versus isolation. How? So the question's going to be how.
Try?
Okay.
Try that?
Because if you have with the same thought, if you have differences of thoughts, then you can integrate those differences of thoughts into society. You can allow that. But if you criminalize it, and then you're just isolating one type of thought.
Can you explain what does integration and isolation mean?
I'll do that in a second. Let's quickly stick with a thought. Okay. Where is your thinking coming from? From your professional training, obviously. Just explain what you mean.
No, I'm just saying it depends what criminalizing means. But if you're going to criminalize individuals and perhaps, I don't know, like send them to jail, that's some type of criminalization, then you're isolating them instead of integrating difference of thoughts into society.
Okay, that's an interesting approach. I think that would be a very interesting analysis in the debate, right?
Yeah.
Fascinating. Integration and isolation usually means something else, but let's talk about that in a second. There was a debate in Germany about restricting the freedom of the press, I think. And proposition stood up and say the press can be dangerous and there is a problem in the system, okay, and compared it to the human body and said if a limb is terminally infected, then you have to bind it off. Okay, you have to take off the limb to save the society. Okay. And everybody's like, oh yeah, that's a good analogy, why not? And then opposition stood up and raised a point of information and said, would you also bind off the head? Okay, I mean, I think it's a brilliant way of deconstructing an argument, but I think this is where it comes from, okay? To say we need to isolate a certain problem and maybe put a hardship on this part that we identified as a problem in order to save the rest. I think that's a reasonable way of thinking. Whether you need to put it in medical terms or not is another question, but sometimes it helps also to push out the boundaries, to draw clear lines, all that kind of thinking. And I think this, I don't know, maybe another debate comes up where you can use that. Try that analysis, it's very interesting. I think this is more usually about, this is a list I have from Britain, so it's probably most best identified in the clash of whether Britain should further integrate into the European Union or whether they should stay their own. So usually it's from the perspective of... Well, yeah, but it's usually from the perspective of an entity that would either maintain their own values or try to integrate into something else. You can also apply it to minority debates, for instance. Whichever group you choose, the blacks or the Native Americans or whoever, or the Roma in these parts, should try to integrate into society and should try to become like the others and assimilate, or whether it's a much better course of action to maintain their own values and stay their own group, and what is the harms, benefits, analysis
That
here.
perhaps applies to the homosexual unit things in the military.
Maybe it does. Try it. You are too clever right now, so you got to do all the thinking.
Well, if you have just homosexual units, although in some way people might appeal to say that you're integrating, you're still isolating them within the within the army, instead of just integrating them as such and having them with no restrictions inside the military.
I think this is more isolation within integration.
I think I think that's actually a good argument, because like the way we ran the case when we debated it was we were in the second government, and our argument was that we do need to isolate and demarcate this group, because we need to give them visibility since you can't see it from their face. So we did kind of argue that we do need to like isolate the group, and it's better for this particular minority. Isolation is better because of the fact that when they're integrated into society, you can't attribute anything to them, because they're kind of faceless. Like you can't see somebody and say, okay, these are the three homosexuals in the unit.
Okay, you can't say there's individual accomplishments by those, but rather, okay.
Yeah, because so you need to demarcate them so that you can give them visibility, which they don't have unless they are isolated.
Yeah. Well, again, this is not eternal truth. I think that's a very interesting approach, okay? To go about it like that and to say, what's the benefit of what? How can we do it? Do we need to mix these groups, or should we put them together? I think one of the problems in this homosexual units debate is that there's a two-step problem. First, you would have to find out whether the no ask, no tell approach is a good one or not, whether the military should acknowledge that homosexuals are in their ranks, and then and how to deal with them. And secondly, the question would be, what do we do about those people if we acknowledge that on the official level? But still, I think that's a very clever analysis. Why not? You can do that. Okay. And like I said, maybe there's more than these could be. What would you say about banning recreational air travel? Okay, this house would ban recreational air travel. No flying around for fun.
Individual versus common good. As the
explain.
Environment being the common good, which is a good for everyone in the country, in the world, and individual good being the good of going for holiday, or however you define it, doing sports, flying.
I would say means
Not sports. I think this is more going on vacation.
But actually, one of the governments defined it that way, so I said however you do it, but more the vacation.
I'd say means versus ends.
Try.
I say Ernie versus Bird.
I think what you're saying.
But I think with the means is correct, because if you ban the creation of flying because you believe you will save the environment, the question is, are you actually contributing to saving the environment proportionally to banning this whole benefits of people flying around to get the cultural education, leisure time and stuff?
So the question is whether negative externalities of flying by plane are bigger than the benefit that these people are getting.
So the harms that flying around causes, or if there's a principled reason to maintain it because people should just be allowed to do it because we live in a rich society, or whatever the argument might be.
Have you ever read this EasyJet flyers and airplanes where they claim scientifically that the short flights, like if you go just within Europe to a different vacation, to Mallorca or somewhere else, contribute less pollution than the longer flights if you fly from London to New York, for example?
Why is that?
They say in terms of saving fuel and how much you emit, somehow because of all this savings in terms of energy, there is apparently...
So you should only promote short-term flying and never be here.
That can well be that it uses less energy than long-term flying, but long-term flying cannot be replaced by trains. So I think that doesn't...
I thought that long-term flying was less harmful because
That's why they produce these flyers, where they actually explain to you in the airplanes that you're thinking wrong.
What is the logic then? Because I always understood that it just blows a lot of stuff into the air when you take off. That was my understanding. And since in a long-term flight there's a long stretch where you just fly straight ahead, which uses significantly less fuel, that's good. I don't know, let's not get into it, but interesting thought. There's this other, I saw another one that the big airplanes, so the A380 and the 747 and all those, they use about as much fuel per passenger per whatever the distance is, like a car. because you can put so many people in, and they blow out a lot of fuel. But it's about like going with 2 people in a car. It's the same amount of fuel you're using on the distance. And just imagine going by car over the ocean. You would need a long bridge, but that would be interesting. And there's a lot of other things. But I think, yeah, why not? These are 2 interesting ways of thinking about it. Whichever one you choose will probably determine the way you analyze it.
But also go like short term versus long term.
Uh-huh.
In the issue that you're asking for long-term benefits in the environment, and acknowledge the fact that you would have all these problems, but those will be very short-term because this concept of travel is a societal construct. With society in the long term, it would only be a short-term inconvenience to have these travel problems, because in the end, in the long term, society will just adapt to this and remove this concept of recreational travel from our needs. It's not like a basic human need that we need to travel to survive. So we can.
Oh, I disagree, but no. I agree. And as you can see, whichever of these clashes you choose to analyze the thing gives you slightly different idea, slightly different concept of what to look for, what kind of proof you need. Okay? Because you will be trying, of course, to always make your value, the side you are proposing, as strong as possible, and trying to show why the other side is not that important.
But I mean, if you look, for example, at integration versus isolation, and let's say you take this migrant case, whether we should force the migrants to integrate into the society by forcing them to learn the language, take the jobs, etc., versus allowing them to keep the integrity.
I think there was an EU that was a Euros motion, wasn't it, in Istanbul? Forcibly settle the Roma, I think was the.
Yeah. But the question is, okay, so it's clearly integration versus isolation issue. On the other side, you can't talk about this without looking what's going to be the short versus the long-term benefits of integrating or isolating the migrant communities. And then you're still going to think about means versus the ends. Is the means of, let's say, having homogeneous society without poor minorities which simply don't get jobs because they don't speak the language? And it's still going to be individual versus the common good. Exactly, again, is it about the coherency of the society, that it exists smoothly without migrants being separated? So it's all...
I think that perhaps in one you could develop a better logic than in the best.
That's firstly, it's a very clever remark. I agree. Okay, I never thought about this. That's a very good analysis. But secondly, I think this means that you can basically choose any of those. Okay, or you can actually develop 2 of those, and say not only is integration more important than letting them have their own culture, but also the means are justified. Okay, that might be different parts of the argument. One is more the principal question of whether it's a good idea to integrate those societies, and the second would then be, can you go about it that way? Principle and practicalities, I think, is sometimes how you divide up debates or how you can do it. But again, if you do that analysis, a judge is going to like it, most likely. If you can show how those basic ideas resonate in the debate and how you're able to frame it in that way, then that's good. That makes it genuinely interesting. That's usually the point where, I mean, you know how judges are, okay? They sit there and they don't expect very much, and usually, well, you don't know how hard it is to be disappointed, so better not expect too much. But then, when people start with stuff like this, that's the moment where the judge says, hang on, I really should listen now. This is getting interesting, okay? We're going somewhere. And this is where I actually then also, I enjoy that, okay? When you start to think long and say, that's a very interesting analysis. That's a way, I've never looked at it, or that's a very clever way of putting it. And that's good, of course. I think it's one of the most important tasks of debaters is to be interesting.
So you have 10 minutes left to tell us how to make our speeches outstanding.
Yeah, well, I think they will be outstanding if you start off with this and then really put in the proper definitions of whatever it is. And then start and stick to the analysis by those lines. And then really, I mean, basically it's a claim that you're doing again. It's this whole idea of deductive logic, okay? You are claiming your side of the argument is stronger than the other one, and what you need to do then is try to substantiate it with whatever material you could find. And obviously, as we've just seen, there's a lot of knowledge around that you can use. And I think this way you make that knowledge accessible. Again, maybe you are not the people to talk to. There might be others who have bigger problems with that. But there are people that always come up with those generic arguments in every single debate, and it's always the same argument, and never put in any specific knowledge about that specific topic, probably because they don't have it, that is boring to death. And you are sitting there as a judge and say, if there's a God, please kill me now. Okay? I don't want another hour of my life wasted on boring speeches. I'd rather have something interesting, something genuinely caring, somebody showing that they have knowledge of the stuff they are talking about, and they are showing that it's good. That is what this is about. Think about Georgia's NATO bid, the debate we had yesterday.
Individual versus common good.
In what do you mean? Who's the individual?
Individual is Georgia, and we thought that why put Georgia in front of all the countries in NATO?
Individual good is maybe that of Mr. Saakashvili,
but it can also be means versus ends. Because you're employing NATO as an institution that you want to do it, and what are the ends, what are the results that you want to achieve.
You can do that as well? Other suggestions?
We kind of use security versus individual liberty.
How did you do that?
Because we talked about the question is that we are letting our decision on Georgia as a sovereign nation making a choice that they want to be part of NATO. So we are letting our decision on their choice be influenced by Russia's temper tantrum threats. So we're demeaning the Georgia sovereignty by saying your choice is not as valuable because we're going to evaluate your choice not on your merits but on somebody else's threat because of the security question there.
Okay.
And how about short term versus long term?
Just a second, let's quickly stick with this one. I think you're stretching it a little bit. This individual liberty usually refers to this framework of the state and the individual as a person. If you can do the analysis, especially in the frame of this academy, it might be very interesting to try it and see if it works out. I'm not quite sure if you get through with it. Okay, short term, long term? Or no, what did you say?
Yeah, whether it's better to accept, if you accept Georgia, what are the short term gains and what will be the long term consequences? Like in the terms of your relationship with Russia and I don't know.
Even though I think who is ever going against the bid would say it's bad in the short term and it's bad in the long term. Okay, so
Why is it bad in the short term?
Because it creates tension with Russia.
Yeah, so that Russia is not going to like it on
but
the
like
long
they're
term.
getting this pipeline that is bringing oil.
I know you can make the argument, but that might not be. The other side might not be accepting the clash and saying no, there's no short-term gain here.
I think the problem that there's no short term because Russia doesn't like Georgia's NATO bid right now, and it's not that it's going to in any way change in the long term. It's just going to get even worse.
Yeah, it's very unlikely that this is the bitter medicine that they have to take now. So in the future, sometime there will be peace and prosperity. That would be short-term and long-term. But
still, yeah.
So to a certain extent, you could do the isolation versus integration argument.
I completely agree.
With isolation being the NATO as it is right now, the good for them. So maybe not integrating Georgia would be who cares, let Russia play their games with them and Ukraine as well. And integrating, caring about world peace, caring about this situation in Georgia.
There's another way you could run that analysis.
Yeah, I would amplify that. I might take this back, but I'd say that it's. I'll try. But I'd say that it's in some way isolating Russia from
precisely. I think that's a very good analysis.
And then versus integrating
Russia into the world.
Whether you want two different dichotomous security structures, and if you put Georgia into NATO, you're obviously saying Russia you're not in, sorry, there's a difference here. Or whether you want to engage Russia in a common framework that somehow is going to work out. That's very interesting. I think that is actually the question that is at hand. How to deal with Russia and whether you engage with them or whether you say no thank you, you stay out, you big bully. We don't want you in. That's excellent. That's exactly it. What about the capitalist experiment has failed?
Individual versus common good or benefit.
Explain.
You might argue that in a capitalistic experiment, it's more the individual that it has the benefit. In other types of governments, you fight for a common good or a common benefit.
What is the presumption of capitalism?
People will act in their own interest.
Sorry?
People will act in their own interest.
They will act on their own interest, and that's the first part of the argument, but what's the second, more important part?
Humans are generically lazy.
They generate
To put it
profit.
very
Resources are scarce.
No, but what is the benefit for society from individuals pursuing their greed?
They generate
Progress of the
profit,
society.
which
Sorry?
they generate profit,
Uh-huh.
which later is going to be turned into the bigger good for the society, because you have this profit from a simple labor giving, which is just something extra on this labor giving.
It's invisible hand, basically.
Invisible hand, yeah, well, I don't like the notion of the invisible hand, because that again I think is something that more clouds the argument than makes it clear. If you say things like the invisible hand, then again you need to explain what you mean by that, and then again you're there with the marketplace and how it's ordered by invisible forces or by the individual greed. But that's the idea, okay? To have a spillover of individuals pursuing their goals, and this will turn into a greater good of society.
Yeah.
And that is the promise of the capitalist experiment. Not taken into account the fact that many people doubt that we ever had capitalism on this planet. Okay, that's another thing. But in general, that is the promise. So I think, yes, it's about individual and common good. So you could say many individuals have achieved a lot, but it hasn't spilled over into the common good. What the other side would defy and say, no, societies are peaceful and prosper and it's good for everybody. Is there other ways of looking at it?
It will be then the same about the means versus the ends, because if you again say that the main promise of capitalism is exactly to generate spillovers for the common good, and then you ask, did you through this form of the production, when you still marginalize certain communities, because the working class will remain the working class, right? The whole point of the profit is that the other class will be generating more profit on the base of the working class, which is going to... Is this means of then this...
I'm not sure.
I can try to argue individual liberty versus security. In the capitalistic experiment, you have individual liberty, where you can choose what you want, how to do it, blah, blah, blah. And in other models, you are assured security, at least of your basic needs, which you not necessarily have under the capitalistic experiment.
Yeah, I was thinking along those lines, but then I also thought that if you really went deep into it or maybe went very Marxist, you can flip that around and talk about capitalism encroaching on individual liberty because of this structure where you're forced to follow these presuppositions and you can't really step outside the capitalist structure while it exists unless you want to starve to death.
But again, I want to say that this would make the debate very interesting. Okay, I don't think it's what originally was intended by liberty versus security, but I think it's very cool. Okay, to say, should we grant people freedom, or should we grant them the promise that they will have bread the next day and something to eat and stuff for their children? There's a lot of societies that still believe that, and so. Again, I think it's very interesting, and I think it genuinely makes stuff more interesting than when you just say capitalism has failed and then go on about why it has failed, as opposed to putting it in such a frame, putting it in such a dichotomy that you can then meaningfully talk about. And whichever one of those you choose, it will alter your analysis, and will also alter the way the debate is being done. And if you're able to put in that analysis, it's very likely that the other side is going to follow. Okay, it's extremely likely that the other side is going to pick it up and try to defend the other side of the argument, which again is something that judges should give you credit for, because you brought in that analysis and you forced the other side to take a certain perspective on the debate. Meaning you had the greater impact, even if you may not win the argument, but judges should give you credit. I'm not sure if they will always do, but they should give you credit for bringing in the relevant analysis that really cleared things up and that forced the other side to take a certain stand. And to look at it from a certain perspective. Okay? Time's up. So let's just quickly to sum up. These are just 5. If you find more, please tell me. I think there might be a few more. And as you've seen, they are not simple. Okay? They look very simple and they are easy to remember. But the way to go about it, as we've seen in this hour, there's many different ways. The other side might attempt to steal your side, or might try to flip you around, as we've just seen with this capitalist idea. I think that's very clever. I think that's a very good way of argumentation. And then you would need to find out how to defend whatever you've been doing. However, if you analyze in that framework, then judges will say, yippee, and give you a first. Okay? Other questions? And I'll say thanks for the attention and have fun in the second lecture.